Of the 40,000 men who served in German U-boats during the Second World War, 30,000 never came home. That's a 75% death rate, higher than any other branch of the German military, higher than the Waffen SS, higher than bomber crews, higher than anyone. And here's what makes this even darker. For the first 3 years of the war, U-boat duty was considered a good assignment. Volunteers lined up for it. The food was better than the army. The victories were celebrated in newspapers. Commanders became national heroes with medals personally awarded by Hitler. Then, everything changed. By 1943, getting assigned to a U-boat was essentially a death sentence. The crews knew it. They went anyway. Most of them never came back. This is the story of the men who fought the Battle of the Atlantic from inside what they themselves called iron coffins, and why so few of them survived. So, let's start from the very beginning. The U-boat war was born from a simple strategic reality. Britain was an island. Everything it needed to fight, food, fuel, weapons, raw materials, rubber, oil, had to cross the Atlantic Ocean on cargo ships. Cut those supply lines and Britain would starve. The war would be over without Germany ever needing to invade. Germany had tried this before, in 1917, with unrestricted submarine warfare, and it almost worked. Britain came within weeks of running out of food, but the campaign also brought America into the war, which ultimately cost Germany everything. This time, Admiral Karl Dönitz believed they could do it smarter. Better submarines, better tactics, and something new, wolf packs. Instead of lone submarines attacking randomly, groups of U-boats would spread across convoy routes, and when one spotted targets, it would radio the others. The pack would gather, wait for nightfall, then attack from multiple directions, simultaneously. Escorts couldn't be everywhere at once. Some ships would always get through the defensive screen. When the war began in September 1939, Germany had just 57 operational U-boats. Only 26 of those were actually suitable for Atlantic operations. Not much of a fleet, but what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in aggression and skill. The early years were called the happy time by U-boat crews, and they meant it. Allied convoys had minimal protection. Escort ships were few and poorly equipped with primitive sonar. Depth charges were inaccurate. You practically had to drop one directly on a submarine to damage it. A skilled commander could surface at night, slip between the escort ships in the darkness, and torpedo merchant vessels almost at will. Commanders like Otto Kretschmer, Günther Prien, and Joachim Schepke became celebrities back home. Their tonnage scores were published in newspapers like Sports Statistics. They received Knight's Crosses personally from Hitler. Kretschmer alone sank 44 ships totaling over 270,000 tons. Prien did something even more audacious. He penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow in October 1939 and torpedoed the battleship Royal Oak while it sat at anchor. 833 British sailors died that night. Prien returned to a hero's welcome. During 1940 and early 1941, U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than British and American shipyards could replace it. Britain was genuinely losing the war at sea. Everyone knew it. Churchill later admitted the U-boat threat was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war. Think about that for a moment. Not the Blitz, not the threat of invasion, submarines. But here's what the German propaganda newsreels didn't mention. Even during the happy time, U-boats were dying. Prien and his entire crew disappeared in March 1941. The boat was never found. Schepke was killed 2 days later when the destroyer HMS Vanuk rammed his conning tower while he stood on it. Kretschmer was captured that same week when his damaged U-boat was forced to surface. The three top aces, all gone within days of each other, and the losses were about to get catastrophically worse. The Allies were learning, fast. Convoys got larger and better organized. Escort groups trained together until they operated as seamless teams. New weapons appeared. Ahead-throwing mortars called hedgehogs that fired patterns of bombs ahead of the ship so you didn't have to pass directly over a submarine to hit it. Long-range aircraft finally closed the mid-Atlantic gap where U-boats had hunted freely. Radar improved. Sonar improved. And most devastating of all, British codebreakers at Bletchley Park cracked the German naval Enigma cipher. This meant the Allies could read U-boat radio traffic, sometimes within hours. They knew where the wolf packs were gathering. They could route convoys around them or send hunter-killer groups directly to submarine positions. By 1943, the happy time was a memory. May of that year became known as Black May in the U-boat service. 41 submarines were destroyed in a single month. Let that sink in. More than one boat every single day for a month straight. Each boat carried about 50 men. That's over 2,000 sailors killed in 31 days. Admiral Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The losses were simply unsustainable, but Hitler demanded they return, and they did. The dying continued. Now I need to tell you what life was actually like inside these boats, because the conditions were almost beyond comprehension. A Type 7 U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet, was about 67 meters long and carried a crew of around 50 men. That sounds manageable until you realize that every available space was crammed with torpedoes, ammunition, food supplies, spare parts, and machinery. The actual living space for 50 men was roughly the size of a school bus, maybe smaller. There were no showers. None. Fresh water was too precious. It was needed for the batteries and for drinking. Crews went entire patrols, sometimes 8 weeks or longer, without washing. The smell inside a U-boat after a few weeks at sea became legendary. Diesel fumes, human sweat, mildew growing on everything, rotting food, the constant stench rising from the bilges. Veterans said the smell soaked into your skin so deeply that their wives could still detect it weeks after they returned home. Bunks were shared in shifts. When one man got up for watch duty, another man climbed into the same bunk he'd just left. The sheets were never changed. Condensation dripped constantly from the cold steel pressure hull. Everything was perpetually damp. Leather boots grew green mold. Bread turned fuzzy within days of leaving port. The crew ate it anyway. And I should mention the toilet situation, because it tells you everything about life on these boats. A U-boat had 2 heads for 50 men. Using them required operating a complex series of valves in exactly the correct sequence. Get the sequence wrong, and the contents would blow back into the boat under pressure, or into your face. It happened more than once. Below certain depths, the toilets couldn't be used at all because the outside water pressure was too great. Men used buckets instead and emptied them when they could. The crews called these boats iron coffins. Even during the good times, they knew what they were climbing into. But all of that, the smell, the cramped quarters, the mold, and the filth, all of that was just discomfort. When the depth charges started falling, everything became terror. I want you to understand what a depth charge attack actually felt like, because nothing else in the war was quite like it. You were trapped in a steel tube, underwater, blind, completely helpless. You couldn't shoot back. You couldn't run, not really. All you could do was go deep, go silent, and listen. First came the sound of destroyer propellers overhead, a rhythmic churning that grew louder as the ship approached your position. Then silence as the ship passed and the charges sank toward you. Veterans described those seconds of silence as the worst part. You knew what was coming, you just didn't know how close. Then the explosions. A British depth charge contained about 290 pounds of explosive. When it detonated, the blast created a shockwave that traveled through water at nearly a mile per second. If it exploded within about 6 meters, the submarine was finished. The pressure hull would crack like an egg, and the ocean would crush you before you could drown. But even charges that detonated farther away could be devastating. The shockwave would slam the hull like a giant hammer. Light bulbs shattered, instruments broke loose from their mounts. Men were thrown off their feet, pipes burst. Cork insulation rained from the ceiling. And in that moment of chaos, as your ears rang and your heart tried to beat out of your chest, one question dominated everything. Did it breach the hull? Then the destroyer would circle back, drop another pattern, and another. Some attacks lasted for hours. The submarine would go completely silent, all unnecessary machinery shut down, men forbidden to speak above a whisper. Everyone barely breathing, drifting as deep as they dared, praying the hunters would lose contact. Herbert Werner survived multiple depth charge attacks and wrote about them after the war. He described men shaking uncontrollably after the explosions finally stopped. Some vomited, some soiled themselves, some simply stared at nothing with blank, empty eyes. Werner admitted he never got used to it. Every attack was as terrifying as the first. The fear never faded. It accumulated. And here's what made the situation truly hopeless. If the boat was badly damaged, you often couldn't surface. Up there, the destroyers were waiting with deck guns that would tear you apart before you could even man your own weapons. But staying down meant the damage might kill you anyway. Flooding you couldn't control, chlorine gas building up from cracked battery cells. air slowly running out. Some crews faced a choice between drowning slowly underwater or being killed quickly on the surface. Some chose to surface and fight, knowing they'd lose. Some chose to stay down and hope for a miracle. Many never got to choose at all. The ocean decided for them. Now I want to tell you about something that shows the impossible situations these men faced. It's called the Laconia incident, and it changed the entire U-boat war. In September 1942, U-156 torpedoed a British troopship called the Laconia off the coast of West Africa. The commander, Werner Hartenstein, surfaced expecting to find enemy soldiers in the water. Instead, he found nearly 2,000 people, including hundreds of women, children, and Italian prisoners of war, civilians. Hartenstein made an extraordinary decision. He began rescue operations. He radioed in the clear, announcing his position and asking for help. Other U-boats joined him. They took survivors aboard, towed lifeboats, gave food and water to people in the sea. For 2 days, German submarines tried to save the people from a ship they had just sunk. Then, American aircraft arrived and bombed the U-boats despite the rescue efforts. Despite the survivors clearly visible in the water, Hartenstein's boat was hit and nearly sunk. After that, Admiral Dönitz issued what became known as the Laconia Order. No more rescue attempts. U-boats were forbidden to pick up survivors or assist sinking ships in any way. The order was later used against Dönitz at the Nuremberg trials, though he was ultimately not convicted on that charge. But think about what that meant for U-boat crews. Before Laconia, some commanders had shown mercy, pointed survivors toward land, shared provisions. After Laconia, they were ordered to torpedo ships and leave. Some followed the order gladly, others struggled with it. All of them had to live with what they did. Let me tell you about some specific men who lived through this. Wolfgang Luth was one of the most successful and longest surviving U-boat commanders of the war. He completed 16 patrols and sank 46 ships. But what made him remarkable wasn't just his record, it was how he kept his crew sane during weeks underwater. Luth organized lectures, debates, and even theatrical performances during long patrols. He rotated men through different duties to prevent crushing boredom. He talked to his crew constantly, explaining decisions, sharing information, treating them like thinking human beings instead of interchangeable parts. Other commanders thought he was soft. His survival rate said otherwise. Luth made it through the entire war at sea. Then, on May 13, 1945, days after the German surrender, he was shot and killed by a German sentry at the Flensburg Naval Academy. He had forgotten the password, survived hundreds of depth charges, killed by his own side over a forgotten word. Reinhard Hardigan commanded U-123 during Operation Drumbeat, the U-boat offensive against American shipping in early 1942. When his boat arrived off the American East Coast, he found defenses that were essentially non-existent. Cities kept their lights on at night, silhouetting merchant ships against the glow of the shore. Hardigan sank ships within sight of American beaches while civilians watched from the boardwalk. He was credited with 22 ships destroyed, and unlike almost everyone he served with, he survived. Not just the war, he survived everything. Became a businessman, raised a family, lived a quiet life in Bremen. He died in June 2018, at the age of 105, one of the very few who made it to old age. But for every Hardigan, there were hundreds who simply vanished. U-534 left for patrol in February 1943 and was never seen again. No distress signal, no survivors, no wreckage found. 53 men gone without a trace. Cause of death unknown to this day. There were many boats like her, overdue from patrol, presumed lost. Families waited for news that never came. After the war, records revealed that many of these disappearances were caused by Allied aircraft catching submarines on the surface. The boats died so fast they never had time to send a signal. Now let me put you inside one of these boats during the worst of it. It's March 1943, North Atlantic. You're 20 years old. You've been at sea for 6 weeks, hunting convoys in water so cold that if you fell in, you'd be dead in minutes. The boat stinks. Your uniform is crusted with salt and diesel and sweat. You haven't seen the sun in 5 days because aircraft keep forcing you to dive. Every time you surface to charge the batteries, someone spots a plane and down you go again. The convoy was spotted yesterday. Your wolf pack has been shadowing it, waiting for nightfall. There are 6 boats in the pack. 3 have already been sunk this patrol. Yours is still alive. 30 minutes ago, you began the attack. Your commander fired 4 torpedoes. You heard 2 explosions. 2 ships hit. Then the escorts came. You're at 180 meters now, deeper than you've ever been. The hull is groaning, actually groaning, like a living thing being squeezed. Test depth for a Type 7 is 230 meters, but nobody really knows where the limit is. Some boats have gone deeper and survived. Some haven't. The destroyer is directly overhead. You can hear the propellers churning through the water. It sounds like someone soaring through metal. Everyone is silent. The lights are off except for red emergency lamps. You can see the faces of the men around you in the dim glow. Some are praying, some are crying. One man is staring at the deck plates, lips moving without sound. Then the depth charges come. The first explosion slams the boat sideways. Something crashes in the forward compartment. Glass shatters. A pipe bursts and the hiss of escaping air fills the silence between explosions. More charges, closer. The hull flexes visibly. You can actually see the steel bending inward before springing back. That shouldn't be possible. You smell chlorine. Sharp, like a swimming pool. That means the battery compartment is flooding. Seawater mixing with battery acid creates chlorine gas. Enough of it will kill you before the ocean gets the chance. 3 more explosions. The closest yet. You're thrown against a valve wheel and feel something crack in your side. The man next to you isn't moving anymore. The chief engineer is shouting damage reports, flooding forward, chlorine spreading aft. You're losing depth control. The commander orders emergency surface. You're coming up whether you want to or not. You'd rather face the guns than choke to death in the dark. The boat rises. You grab a life jacket. You've never worn it before. It always seemed like bad luck. The conning tower hatch opens and men scramble up into cold air and gunfire and searchlights and chaos. You never see what happens next because something hits you. And then there's only cold water and darkness and the distant sound of propellers fading away. Of the 50 men on your boat, 9 will be pulled from the water alive. By the end of the war, the statistics told a story that no propaganda could hide. Germany commissioned over 1,100 U-boats during the conflict. 783 were destroyed. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served, approximately 30,000 were killed. That's 3 out of every 4. Gone. No other military branch in any nation came close to these casualty rates. British Bomber Command, which had horrific losses, lost about 44% of its aircrew. American submariners in the Pacific lost around 22%. German U-boat crews lost 75%. And here's something that still haunts me. The losses weren't spread evenly across the war. In 1940, the death rate was dangerous, but survivable. Maybe 1 in 5 boats lost. By 1944, going out on patrol was almost certainly fatal. New boats were being sunk on their first missions before the crews had any experience at all. Some boats lasted only days. Some lasted hours. The men knew this. They had access to the numbers. They watched friends leave on patrol and never return. They did the math themselves. Yet volunteers continued to step forward until the very end. Some believed in the cause. Some felt duty to their country. Some simply had no choice. Refusing submarine duty meant disgrace, prison, or the Eastern Front. Dönitz kept sending them out because Hitler demanded it and because the alternative, admitting the U-boat war was lost, was unthinkable. So the boats sailed and the boats sank, and the boys inside them died with them. After the surrender in May 1945, surviving U-boats were ordered to surface, fly black flags, and report to Allied ports. Over 150 boats complied. Their crews became prisoners of war, but they were alive. Many later said that the moment they surrendered was the first time in years they actually believed they might see their families again. The legacy of the U-boat campaign is complicated, and I think it's important to acknowledge that these men fought for Nazi Germany. Their mission was to starve Britain into submission. Allied merchant sailors, civilians, many of them, died in their thousands because of what U-boat crews did. There's no escaping that reality. No amount of suffering erases the suffering they caused. But there's also no erasing what the U-boat crews themselves endured. The weeks underwater in conditions that would break most people. The depth charge attacks that left permanent psychological scars. The constant knowledge that every patrol might be their last. And for 3 out of 4 of them, it was. When the war ended, surviving U-boat veterans went home to a destroyed country and tried to rebuild their lives. Many never spoke about what they had experienced. Some couldn't. The memories were too much, Others talked freely, trying to make sense of years spent underwater waiting to die. The last German commander, who led a combat U-boat patrol, died in 2018. Reinhard Hardigan, the man who once sank ships off American beaches, passed away quietly in Germany at 105. He had outlived almost everyone who ever served with him. He was one of the lucky 25%. For the other 30,000, the Atlantic became their grave. Most of their boats have never been found. They're still down there, scattered across the ocean floor from Norway to Brazil, rusting slowly in the darkness. The crews are still aboard, they're still waiting.